Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction series. Well, the people have spoken overwhelmingly on Patreon and what they wanted to see by something like a 3-1 margin over any other choice was Kings and Generals series on Caesar in Gaul. So we're going to start into it today. I would say on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being who is Caesar, and 10 being my knowledge of the American Civil War, for example, I'd put myself at around a 4 or 4.5 when it comes to the life of Julius Caesar and what he did in Gaul. I know some of what went on. I know that Gaul was where he really made a name for himself. I know a lot about what he did going up against Vercingetorix and people like that. But I'm here to learn, just like the rest of you are, and I know that some of you watching this are experts in this field, and you know way more about Rome and about this time and place than I do, so I am looking forward to hearing your feedback, your observations, your comments in the section below. Also want to let you know, if you are a patron or considering being one, we have now updated all of the patron rewards with the new Vlogging Through History merch. So whether it's the stickers, the mug, the long sleeve t-shirt, or the hoodies that are available at different levels of patron, those are now all with our new Vlogging Through History logo, and we'll try to update those every so often so those that are longtime patrons can continue to receive new rewards. So thank you to all of you who support this channel and make all of the time that I put into this worth it. I'm going to be going to Boston and Maine next week, so you'll be hearing more about that and be planning on seeing some on-location videos from our family vacation to Boston and to Maine. Let's dive into Kings and Generals. There's a link in the description below that will take you to the original content. This video is like an hour and a half long, so we'll take it in chunks. Here we go.
The Gauls were one of Rome's oldest and most bitter enemies. They had sacked Rome and throughout the centuries fought alongside the Republic's most dangerous adversaries, including Pyrrhus and Hannibal. By the end of the 2nd century BC, southern Gaul was largely subdued. However, there was still tension in northern Gaul, particularly along the Rhine. These tensions would ultimately climax in the Gallic Wars, the conflict that would shape the future of Western Europe for centuries to come, giving rise to the Holy Roman Empire and modern-day France. The conflict that would forever etch the name Gaius Julius Caesar in the annals of history.
So let's say a couple of things up front about this. First of all, Gaul, if you're looking on a map, if you're thinking, where's Gaul? Gaul is basically modern France. It's G-A-U-A, Gaul, or G-A-U-L, Gaul, the Gallic Wars. It's, by and large, it's kind of the borders of modern-day France. That's the easiest way to describe it. One big misconception that people have about the Gauls and about what we call the barbarians in general, they weren't these mindless hordes. They weren't these basically cavemen going up against the might and the skill and technology of the Roman Empire. Some of these Gallic tribes were every bit as complex in terms of their government and the way they did things as Rome was. And you have the same kinds of things like triumvirates, for example, where you have multiple men helping to lead. You have the same kind of fights for power that happened in Rome. Anything you could say about Rome as far as how things operate, a lot of that you could say about the Gauls as well.
Rome had been rocked by almost half a century of civil wars, and the Republic was in decline. Both Marius and Sulla had marched on Rome, highlighting the ineffectiveness of the system for maintaining a large empire, and the fact that the legionaries were more loyal to their generals than to the state.
And, you know, that's another interesting thing. They talk about Marius and Sulla marching on Rome. People, when they think of marching an army on Rome, they think of Caesar, right? I mean, they think of what he did when he crosses the Rubicon. And you have that whole thing where here I desecrated, abandoned law and desecrated peace and all that stuff that he says. And then the die is cast when he crosses the Rubicon. He was not the first guy to do that. He was just the most effective at doing it.
Following this chaotic period, 3 men had established an unofficial alliance to effectively control the Republic. This was the first triumvirate, consisting of the famous general Pompey the Great, the richest man in Rome, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. Caesar had been consul the year before in 59 BC, but his political campaigning had left him in debt, and made him many enemies in Rome. He needed to make money fast and gain enough military success to keep his political adversaries at bay. When the time came for distributing provinces for Caesar to govern as proconsul, he was able to use his political allies to secure Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and Transalpine Gaul for an unprecedented 5 years. This put Caesar in control of 4 veteran legions, the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th, all of whom had fought with Caesar before in Hispania and were loyal to him. They had a total of roughly 22,000 legionaries, plus auxiliaries. Caesar now had the men he needed. All he needed was an excuse for war.
So, just like today, when it comes to politics, you have jealousy and backstabbing and competing for position and all that sort of thing. And you've got Pompey the Great, as he's known by this time, Pompey Magnus, was what it would be in Latin. And, he's already won great victories, and he's kind of secured his position. And he is there with Crassus in Rome. And Crassus is kind of the odd man out because you've got these 2 great military leaders who have following and have loyal soldiers, and Crassus doesn't really have that to the degree that Pompey and Caesar do. But Caesar kind of finds himself almost on the outside because he's not in Rome. He's not there in the seat of power. And so what he's doing is the next best thing, which is getting control of provinces that are on the border with these barbarians that need to be put down. And now he's going to pick a fight so he can conquer territory and come back to Rome, the great hero, kind of like Pompey has been.
Fortunately for Caesar, a Celtic tribe, the Helvetii, was planning a migration into Gaul in 58 BC. Their leader, Orectorix, had formed a confederation with a number of neighbouring tribes, the Tulingi, Latubrigi, Rauraki, and Boii, and now they numbered 368,000 men, women, and children.
So Caesar's got 22,000 legionnaires, and he's going up against the Helvetii, which is basically modern-day Switzerland, that kind of area. And they've got 300,000, of which you got to figure there's at least 10% are going to be warriors. So he's going to be going up against substantially more men than what he's got. And they actually had Orectorix was one of these triumvirates, in one of these triumvirates himself, that was kind of competing for power. And there's a lot of parallels actually between what he's dealing with and what Caesar's dealing with.
Orectorix had even convinced them all to burn their homes in order to leave no option of failure. However, soon he was accused of being a tyrant and was forced to commit suicide.
There's actually some debate about that from what I've read about whether he really committed suicide or wasn't really forced to, or he chose to commit suicide because he was going to be sentenced to be burned alive, and so suicide was like the better option in that case. But yeah, there's some parallels here too with how they burned their settlement so they couldn't go back. I think of people like Cortez, who burns his ships famously when his men land on the eastern shore of Mexico, so that they don't have a plan B, that they've got to go inland, they've got to be conquistadors, and they've got to achieve victory, or else they die because there's no going back.
Command passed to Divico. Divico was determined to stick to the plan and began amassing supplies in order to start pouring into Gaul. To do this, they would either have to pass through the land of the Roman ally Aedui and the province of Transalpine Gaul, or take the longer route through the mountain passes in the north. The Romans had built up a healthy fear of migrating tribes following the Cimbrian War in 113 to 101 BC.
So let's talk about that war for just a second. So here's the Cimbrian War that he was making reference to. And you can see the migrating tribes who come all the way down from Jutland up in northern Denmark, modern-day Denmark. And you can see that over this 12 years, the Romans lose 110,000 Roman soldiers killed. That's a lot. And of course, all the Cimbri leaders were killed or captured, and they suffered even greater casualties. 350,000 killed, 150,000 enslaved. But it was devastating for the Romans to have this happen, especially early on. But eventually things get turned around. But this is in recent memory. I mean, you're talking, what, 60 years or so before the Gallic Wars. So that's the time frame between for us today and the early stages of the Vietnam War. So it was very recent memory for them.
And so Caesar, hearing of this, was only too willing to come to the rescue of the Aedui. He took the only available legion in the area and force-marched them up to Geneva, destroying the bridge on the Rhone that provided access into Transalpine Gaul. The Helvetii appealed to Caesar, asking for military access through Roman lands and promising they would not attack. Caesar played for time, pretending to consider this offer for almost 15 days. Using this time, his legion was able to construct a fortified embankment almost 5 meters high, stretching 20 miles along the riverbank.
And one of the things that we'll find is that throughout these wars, Caesar makes heavy use of fortifications, especially walls and things like that. This is something that he did regularly. It wasn't a bunch of, fighting in open terrain. Caesar took every advantage he could to give himself the best chance to win.
With the legion manning the embankment and now in a stronger position, Caesar denied the Helvetii access and refused to allow them to cross. Some of the Helvetii ignored this and attempted to cross nonetheless in small boats, but were prevented from doing so by the legionaries throwing javelins and shooting arrows into them. With the southern route thus blocked, the Helvetii decided to take the longer northern route through the mountains into Gaul.
So this is a nightmare scenario for the Helvetii because they've burned everything. They can't go back. And they probably weren't expecting Caesar to come along with the Romans and deny them passage. They were trying to migrate into Gaul. So where are they going to go now? What are they going to do? They're probably going to run short on time. This was all probably planned out because you got to think about harvests and food sources and all of these sorts of things. Now they're going to start to get desperate, and desperate people, come to desperate measures.
Leaving his top lieutenant, Labienus, in command, Caesar returned to Italy to levy a further 2 legions and to pull the other 3 veteran legions out of their winter quarters in Aquileia, bringing his total to approximately 33,000 legionaries plus auxiliaries. Despite Labienus being in a strong position to easily block the mountain pass, the Helvetii managed to push into Gallic territories and began ravaging the land. The Gauls pleaded with Caesar to intervene and chase the Helvetii out, and Caesar, yet again, was only too willing to help.
So here they are. They've made it. They're going to get into Gaul just fine. Caesar's not up there. And now the Gauls actually appeal to Caesar and say, come deal with these people. So now he's going to come hunt them down.
Marching his legions into the Gallic territories. The decision of Labienus to not hold the Helvetii in the mountains was likely an order received from Caesar. The Celts were now in open terrain, which better suited the Roman legions, and their pillaging of Gaul gave Caesar an excuse to intervene. Word reached Caesar that the Helvetii were currently attempting a crossing at the Arar River. They had been crossing in 4 large groups, using many rafts and boats, but due to the size of the horde and their lack of organization, the crossing had already taken them days, and one group was still yet to cross.
Let's just take a moment and just really appreciate how much detail we have about these events that happened 2,000 years ago. In large part because Caesar himself made sure that this stuff got written down, probably so that he could tell his story, it's just great that after all this time we've got so much information. And of course, kings and generals, they just do such a great job of presenting that information to you so that you can really visualize it and understand it.
Caesar took his legions and swiftly marched to the river. Quickly forming his legions into battle formation, Caesar fell upon the Celts waiting to cross. Caught unaware, unprepared, and encumbered by their baggage, the Helvetii did not even have enough time to form a proper battle line. The fighting was over quickly, with the whole stranded group being killed or fleeing into the nearby woods, whilst the other 3 groups could do nothing but watch helplessly from the other side of the river. The main Helvetii force began to move on, and, not wanting to lose the initiative, Caesar quickly built a bridge across the river and moved all of his 6 legions across.
So one of the things that you'll notice is that sometimes he calls them Helvetii, sometimes he refers to them as Celts. And so it's important for us to kind of talk about that. And you can see this map here, a map of Gaul during this time frame. And you can see the different regions that you have. All of this, of course, would be Gaul. But the Celtica is this kind of main area here. And the Helvetii are right here. They are a Celtic tribe, but there are many Celtic tribes during this time. You got the Picts over here, and you can kind of see the map, the different groups that are all over the place. But just letting you know, Helvetii are a smaller group of the larger group of Celts that he's referring to.
The crossing that had taken the Celts 20 days had taken the Romans just 1. Caesar began tailing the Helvetii, waiting for the right time to strike. There were a few minor cavalry skirmishes, but nothing decisive. Caesar did once manage to find a battlefield that was advantageous, and even had Labienus in position behind the enemy. However, due to poor communication from his scouts, Caesar was forced to pull back from the battlefield. This caused a delay in Caesar's plan, and he was beginning to run low on rations. He decided to head for the nearby town of Bibracta to resupply his army before continuing the pursuit. As he began to march off, however, Divico gave chase, harassing the rear of the Roman army. Caesar sent his cavalry and light infantry to fight a delaying action in order to buy time to deploy his main force on a nearby hill. The 4 veteran legions formed 3 lines at the front, with the 2 newly levied legions along with the auxiliaries positioned further up the hill. These men were not tested in battle, and so were not expected to do any of the fighting. Instead, they were to guard the baggage and were spread thin across the hill to seemingly increase the size of Caesar's army.
So the auxiliary legions are going to be your kind of secondary, almost like your conscripts, so to speak. These are not your mainline Roman legions. Comparable, think of the American Revolution, the difference between your Continental Line and your local militia that you have. The Continental Line were the ones that were going to carry the battle for you. The militia might be expected to get off a shot or two and then probably would run.
The Helvetii, numbering somewhere between 60 to 90,000 warriors, had successfully fought off the Roman cavalry and light infantry, forcing them to retreat. Now they had formed their infantry into a tightly packed shield wall and advanced on the Romans. The front 2 lines of legionaries opened the battle with a volley of javelins. These hampered the Helvetii by becoming stuck in their shields, forcing them to drop them and break into a looser formation.
So the javelin, the Roman javelin, is an important weapon throughout Rome's history. And in this case, while they're not necessarily causing too much damage to the men with these things, they're forcing them to break up their shield wall because they're throwing these javelins, and the javelins are designed in such a way that they can really pierce these shields. And now they can't get the javelins out of the shields, and so they've got to toss them aside, and so now they have to break up their shield wall, and the whole basis of their strategy and their formation has been thrown out of whack.
With the shield wall in disarray, the Roman front lines charged into melee. The fighting was intense and tough, but the Romans' discipline and experience gave them the edge. Slowly they began to get the upper hand, with the Helvetii being forced back to a nearby mountain. However, as the Romans pressed up the mountain, a portion of the Helvetii allies, composed of Boii and Tulingi, roughly 15,000 warriors, entered the battle. These men had been acting as a rearguard, protecting the camp, and now they fell on the Roman flank, threatening to encircle them.
Gonna need the auxiliaries.
The Helvetii, bolstered by the arrival of their allies, began pushing back with renewed vigour. With the 2 front lines of legionaries already engaging the Helvetii on the mountain, Caesar committed his final line of veterans, which had been acting as a reserve. After hours of hard fighting, the Helvetii on the mountain were eventually broken and forced from the battle. However, the Boii and Tulingi fell back to the camp to make a last stand. Using their baggage wagons, they formed a makeshift rampart and continued the fight, hurling missiles down into the Roman ranks. This is where the fighting was the most difficult, as the Boii were famed warriors and fought desperately. Finally, after fighting long into the night, the third line was able to break into the camp.
Do you imagine how exhausted these people must be? This isn't hiding behind a tree or in a trench shooting at each other and reloading and shooting again from a distance, which would have been exhausting in and of itself. This is hand-to-hand combat. This is close range fighting for hours and hours and hours. I can't imagine how you'd have the strength to go on fighting like this.
Ending the battle. The battle had lasted almost 12 hours. Caesar had lost perhaps 5,000 men, whilst the Helvetii had lost around 40 to 60,000.
Wow.
Of the 368,000 people who began the migration, only 130,000 were now left.
8-to-1 casualties. I mean, geez. So, I mean, that tells you a lot about the situation that these barbarian tribes, as we called them, were up against with the Romans. The Romans did have, strong tactics, strong weapons, strong training, and that was able to overcome much, much larger forces that they faced from time to time. So we've only actually gotten through about 11 minutes of the video so far. So let's go a little bit further into this before we stop for the day.
Caesar, with no cavalry to speak of, was not able to give chase immediately, and gave his men 3 days in order to recover from the battle before starting the pursuit. The Helvetii, seeing the Romans chasing them once more, surrendered completely and were forced to return to their homeland and made a vassal of Rome,
where
acting
they had burned
as a
everything
buffer between Roman and Germanic lands. Caesar had achieved his aim of gaining a swift military victory, and for now he would be able to hold off his political enemies in Rome. Furthermore, the Romans had now shown themselves to be a powerful force in the Gallic theatre. After his victory, Caesar rested in Bibracte for a short time before moving on. Rumour had already reached him of a Germanic tribe that had crossed the Rhine and was terrorising Gaul. The Suebi, led by their king Ariovistus, had first arrived in Gaul in 63 BC as mercenaries for the Sequani and Averni in their war against the Aedui, a Roman ally. The 15,000 warriors that Ariovistus initially brought proved decisive, helping to secure a crucial victory over the Aedui at the Battle of Magito Briga.
So let's talk about him for just a second. So Ariovistus, as we've already learned, was a Swabian chief who led a large force of Germans across the Rhine in the years just before the outbreak of Caesar's Gallic War, carved out a sizable kingdom in Alsace before being defeated by Caesar. So Alsace, of course, is that region right up in here that was long fought over eventually between the Germans and the French, all the way up into the 20th century. So it's kind of on that border region between the Germanic tribes and the Gallic tribes,
which forced the Aedui to become a tributary to the Sequani. In response to this, the Aedui sent an envoy, Diviciacus, to ask Rome for help, but the Republic was still recovering from the political shock of the Catiline conspiracy and was distracted by an Allobroges revolt. The governor of Transalpine Gaul was ordered to help Rome's Gallic allies when possible, and in 59 BC, the Senate named Ariovistus a friend of the people of Rome to pacify him and keep him in check.
And people forget that too. As much as Rome was known for conquering tribes, they also used a lot of diplomacy. Whenever possible, they recognized the importance of getting people on your side, getting people to fight for you instead of against you, and bringing people kind of under the umbrella of the greater Roman Empire. So this is an example of that, although it doesn't last in this case.
Ariovistus used that time to consolidate his position. After helping the Sequani, he demanded a third of their lands as payment. The Sequani gave in, and Ariovistus began moving more of his people across the Rhine to settle in this new land. By 58 BC, as many as 120,000 Suebi had now crossed the Rhine and made their home in Gaul.
So this is an example of what I'm talking about, how you have a lot of the same things happening with the barbarians that you have happening in Rome. You've got a guy here who is making conquest. He's conquering and gathering territory for himself. He uses diplomacy to buy time for himself by being a friend of Rome temporarily, while he can acquire more land and consolidate his power and build up his base. And then he'll eventually have the big showdown against Caesar.
Furthermore, Ariovistus was demanding more Sequani territory in order to settle an extra 24,000 Germans, and had been taking hostages in order to keep the Sequani and Aedui obedient. Something had to be done. Following his victory over the Helvetii, Caesar had taken some time to rest in Bibracte. Whilst encamped there, he was visited by a council of Gallic leaders and diplomats, led by Diviciacus. They complimented Caesar on his victory and implored him to intervene in the situation, pointing out that if the Germans continued their conquests, soon the Suebi would be directly bordering Roman territory.
You need to do something about this guy, who is a big problem for us, but eventually he'll be a problem for you if you don't deal with him. So they're kind of playing to Caesar a little bit there, to try and get him on their side and get him to do what they want him to.
Caesar, again, was happy to oblige. As Ariovistus was a friend of Rome, however, Caesar could not immediately go to war. Instead, Caesar first invited Ariovistus to meet him, which was declined. Then he sent a diplomat to Ariovistus, asking him to return the Gallic hostages he had taken and to stop any hostilities. Caesar reminded him that if he were to comply, the Romans would still consider him a friend of Rome and not take any action against him. This was a good deal for Ariovistus. He'd be allowed to keep the lands he had already taken from the Sequani without a fight.
Now, we've talked time and time again on this channel, no matter what the conflict, no matter what the time period, about people who don't know when to stop. And how many times in history people have made great conquests but went just a little too far. And of course, it's easy to sit back in hindsight and see how they went a little too far. Because you could say, well, what if Caesar had gone a little too far? Nobody really knows until they get their butts kicked that they've gone too far. But we see this happen a lot.
Instead of accepting the terms, Ariovistus doubled down and sent a message back to Caesar saying that if the Romans could conquer where and how they liked, so could he. At the same time, the 24,000 new Germans who had crossed the Rhine were allowed to raise and pillage the Gallic lands as they pleased, with more Germans preparing to cross the river to join Ariovistus. Caesar now had his justification, as he had a legal decree from the Senate to protect Rome's Gallic allies. He could justify that the Suebi were threatening Rome's borders, and Ariovistus had forfeited his status as a friend of Rome by continuing to pillage the land of Rome's allies. Yet again, Caesar had the chance to market himself as the savior of Gaul. So
Caesar, his desire and his secret kind of wish is to be able to win glory for himself, to win battles, to conquer territory. But he can't be seen as the aggressor, as the conqueror. So he's able, in every one of these situations, to spin himself as the defender, as the protector of the people, who's just trying to help out their friends and allies.
His 6 legions, roughly 30,000 men, Caesar set out on the warpath. Both Ariovistus and Caesar recognized the importance of Vesontio, the largest town in the Sequani territories. Well fortified and well supplied, it would be crucial to the war effort. Both forces began marching to the town. However, the Romans, marching day and night, were able to get there first. Caesar rested there briefly while supplying the legions. But as they rested, rumours began reaching the men of the strength and ferocity of the Germans. Even some of Caesar's officers began having their doubts, and it almost seemed as if Caesar would have a mutiny on his hands. Caesar was, however, able to restore order by insisting that he would face Ariovistus with just his most trusted 10th Legion if none others would follow.
This is a similar tactic to something that George Washington did, where when the men start to threaten mutiny, start to act like they're going to give up, you use a guilt trip on them. So in Washington's case, when the men are going to mutiny and march on Congress because they haven't been paid near the end of the war, the Revolutionary War, he does this thing where he pulls out a speech and then he pulls out his glasses and he says, I apologize for having to put on my spectacles. I've not only grown gray, I've also grown almost blind in the service of my country. And that kind of shamed them into complying. Caesar says, well, you know what? If you guys are going to run because you're afraid of how many men they have, I'll face them alone with just this one legion. And that shames them into fighting.
This inspired a fanatical loyalty in the 10th Legion, whilst the others, motivated by shame at being thought of as cowards, rallied, and the legions began to march out to meet the Suebi. Ariovistus, impressed with the speed at which the Romans had been able to move and take Vesontio, sent messages to Caesar asking for a meeting,
now he wants
with only
to meet.
some cavalry allowed as bodyguards, at the place called Vosges in modern-day Alsace. Caesar agreed, but the meeting did not go well.
I always thought, I'm totally capable of being wrong about this, I always thought that was pronounced Vosges. Is it Vosges? Somebody help me out who lives in that region. Tell me how it's pronounced.
Both generals reiterating their positions. Ariovistus even went so far as to say that if he were to kill Caesar, there would be many in Rome that would be grateful, showing that he knew what the political situation in Rome was.
These weren't barbarians, like I said. These are smart people who had complex thought and tactics and abilities and similar things going on in terms of politics. He understood Rome.
Negotiations broke down after this, and the cavalry on both sides had a minor skirmish before retreating back to their respective camps. A few days later, Ariovistus asked for another meeting. Caesar, sensing a trap, sent his translators. This was just as well, as Ariovistus promptly captured the two and even considered burning them alive.
Jeez.
With his plan to capture Caesar having failed, Ariovistus instead moved to battle. His army was composed of 6,000 cavalry, 16,000 light infantry, and the rest heavier infantry, for a total of around 30,000 to 40,000 men. Taking Caesar by surprise, Ariovistus marched his force quickly behind Caesar's position and set up camp, cutting off the Romans from their supply lines.
I have a feeling after we're done with this series, I'm going to be wanting to play some of the Total War Rome Remastered on my gaming channel, which if you haven't seen my gaming channel, there's a link in the description that'll take you over there. Right now we're doing a series on Grand Tactician, the Civil War, and one on Crusader Kings 3, but been wanting to get back into some Total War. Maybe Rome's the one we're going to do.
For 5 days, Caesar drew out his army in battle formation, willing to give battle, but Ariovistus was content to wait and strangle Caesar's supply line, only engaging in cavalry skirmishes. The Suebi cavalry fought in a unique fashion. For every horseman, there was an infantryman mixed into their formation. These men were lightly armed in order to keep up with the cavalry, and together provided a flexible and difficult force to handle, and the Roman cavalry got the worse of the fighting. Caesar, knowing that he would have to do something to break the stalemate or else risk being starved out, formed his legions into 3 lines. He marched this force past the Suebi position and ordered the third line to begin construction of a second camp, whilst the first two lines formed up to defend them. Ariovistus sent all of his light infantry and cavalry to harass the legionaries, but seemed reluctant to commit his entire force, and so they were easily held off by the Romans. With the second camp complete, Caesar left 2 legions and part of his auxiliaries to defend it, whilst his other 4 legions returned to the main camp. Realizing that Caesar would now be able to use this second camp to reconnect with his supply line, Ariovistus sent part of his army to attack this second camp. The fighting was tough, lasting from midday into the evening, but eventually the Romans were able to repel the attack and even took some prisoners. Upon questioning these Suebi, Caesar learnt that Ariovistus had apparently been told by his priests not to commit his army until after the new moon, which was why he had not used his whole army to prevent the legions constructing their second camp.
Here's the importance of intelligence and being able to use every bit of information to your advantage, and that is a key piece of information.
Having learnt this, Caesar decided to go on the offensive. Leaving a small garrison in each camp, Caesar formed his 6 legions into a triple-axis formation with his cavalry in reserve and marched on the Suebi camp. The Germans came out to meet him, forming their wagons and baggage train into a semicircle behind them, their women standing on them urging the men on.
Cheerleaders, I love it.
The German left flank was slightly weaker, Caesar positioned himself opposite on the Roman right and gave the order for his men to charge. But as he did, the Suebi also charged. Their assault was so fast and surprising that the Romans had to drop their pila before they could even throw them, drawing their swords and fighting in hand-to-hand combat. The Germans managed to form a shield wall, and neither side seemed able to gain an upper hand. Having been unable to throw their javelins before charging, the Romans struggled to break the shield wall as easily as they had at the Battle of Bibracte.
Yeah, so if you remember, they throw the javelins, which causes the enemy to have to get rid of their shields. They're not able to do this, and so this is pretty brilliant on the part of the Germans to kind of disrupt the strategy. And they probably had heard about what had happened with the Helvetii, and they adjusted to compensate for that, and it worked.
After some hard fighting, the Roman right, led by Caesar, started to push back the German left. However, the Suebi on the right outnumbered their Roman opponents and were starting to get the upper hand. The Roman cavalry, led by the son of Triumvir Marcus Licinius Crassus, Publius, had not yet engaged in the battle, and from his position he could see the Roman left starting to crumble. Using his own initiative, Crassus led the third line, which had been kept in reserve, to support the flank, arriving just in time to avoid a disaster.
So here's one of the important factors here is having a reserve that you can deploy when you start to buckle somewhere. You can see they don't have that reserve. They've got everybody committed to the front lines.
With their left flank broken and their right now under severe pressure, the Suebi army broke and ran. It is not known how many people died in this battle, but the Germans attempting to retreat through their wagons were said to have been packed so tightly that the dead could not even fall over.
Let's take a look and see what history tells us the numbers were from this battle. So some sources I've looked at just say light on the Roman side and heavy on the Suebi side, but this particular number here says about 35,000 killed out of 70,000. Now, the video we've been watching said they didn't have nearly that many. They said they only had in the 30,000 range. Again, about 6,000 killed or wounded for the Romans. So either way, once again, a very one-sided number in terms of the casualties. We'll watch another minute or so, and then I think we'll wrap this up.
The entire Suebi force, including Ariovistus, fled back across the Rhine, pursued by the Roman cavalry. Caesar had won 2 important campaigns in one season. For now, he left Labienus to winter with the legions in Sequani territory, whilst he attended to his governing duties in Cisalpine Gaul.
Alright, so we'll wrap it up right there. A long way to go. We are just getting started. I hope you guys are enjoying this as much as I am. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, your own observations about all of this, and we will be back tomorrow with part 2. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our look at kings and generals, Caesar in Gaul. Well, as I completely expected, we had a lot of fantastic input to yesterday's first video in this series. If you didn't see the first video in my reaction, the link's in the description, as well as a link to the video that we are reacting to, which is about an hour and a half long, so we're taking it in chunks, as well as a completely expected reaction on my own part, which is that I've been absorbing all things Rome. I have purchased and installed Rome Remastered for Total War, and I'm very soon going to be playing that on my gaming channel, which there's a link in the description for that as well. And I've also started rewatching HBO's Rome series, which I know is not completely factual, but has a lot of the main events surrounding the Civil War that comes after the Gallic Wars. So I'm also going to look for a few books. I'm even thinking about reading Caesar's own book about these events, on which most of what we know is based. So let's go ahead and dive right into part 2.
But by wintering his legions in Gallic territory, Caesar was making a point. This was beginning to look less like intervention and more like occupation. With the Germanic threat dealt with, Caesar would be able to turn his attention to Gaul proper. The Belgae were a loose collection of various tribes, and had fought constant wars with the Germanic tribes across the Rhine.
So yeah, a good way to think about this, and it's interesting if you notice where a lot of our modern names that we get for these countries comes from. You got the Belgae in the area around modern-day Belgium. You've got the Gauls, who are where France is today. You've got the Germanic tribes for modern-day Germany. So Caesar, Caesar has been, at this point, defending Gaul against Germanic tribes. Now you're going to have the Belgae coming down from the north, and this is, if I remember, it's been years since I've studied this, probably the most serious threat that Caesar faces. I mean, he very nearly loses to one of these Belgae tribes. So I guess that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Which had fostered a strong and experienced warrior culture. They knew of how successful Caesar had been in Gaul already, and were justifiably suspicious of his intentions. To counter the rising Roman threat, the Belgae formed a confederation, led by King Galba of the Suessiones. Labienus sent word of this coalition to Caesar in Cisalpine Gaul, who immediately took action. Caesar raised a further 2 legions and moved straight to the Belgae border. It is worth noting that Caesar now had 8 legions under his command, approximately 44,000 men including auxiliaries, double the amount he had initially been allocated by the Senate. Furthermore, while the Belgae raising an army could certainly be seen as a potential threat, Caesar made no efforts to get the casus bellis he had when fighting the Helvetii and Suebi.
So casus belli would be a reason for war. A couple of things I want to follow up on from yesterday based on a lot of your comments. And as always, it says right on my banner, we're learning history together. So I told you up front, I don't know everything. So I've been welcoming your input and your corrections where necessary. Some of you pointed out when I talked yesterday about how exhausted the men must have been. Some of you pointed out correctly that the Romans actually had a system for dealing with that kind of combat exhaustion where they actually took shifts. And the very opening scene of HBO's Rome shows a bit of this, where you have the frontline men and then you have several rows deep behind each one of them, and they're kind of holding out in front of them, and you have a leader who will blow a whistle, and when the whistle blows, the man in front drops to the rear and the next guy up continues to fight, and so they stay fresh up front. And it's really a brilliant way to do things if you're able to keep from having to use all your men at once. Another thing that some of you mentioned correctly is that Just because a unit was an auxiliary unit does not necessarily mean that they weren't veterans and they weren't capable units. I kind of implied otherwise yesterday, which wasn't really my intention, but I made the comparison to militia, with them not being regular Roman units. Well, these were people that, remember, a lot of these outlying Roman territories that were under the subjugation of Rome, those people were not Roman citizens, and so they couldn't, by the nature of not being Roman citizens, serve in a Roman legion. And so just because they're in an auxiliary unit just means they weren't Roman citizens. It doesn't mean they weren't capable soldiers.
The Republic had less and less control over Caesar, and many in Rome were beginning to talk about these conquests not being in Rome's best interest, but in Caesar's.
They were.
Nevertheless, Caesar marched his legions quickly into the territory of the nearest Belgic tribe, the Remi, who were completely taken aback by the speed at which the Romans had been able to mobilize, and surrendered instantly, swearing to Caesar that they had never been a part of the Confederation.
We weren't part of what was going on. We're sorry. It was never our intention to fight against you. Now, something key there they mentioned, they talk about how they were surprised by Caesar's speed. And this is something that will come later on when Caesar ends up in a civil war against Pompey Magnus and others, is that he's able to take Rome because he gets to Rome with the 13th Legion way faster than they thought he could. And Pompey doesn't have time to gather his own legions to be able to defend the city.
The Remi even provided Caesar with all the information they had on the alliance, including which tribes were involved, how many men each tribe was contributing, and that they were currently marching towards the Remi's territory. With this information, Caesar convinced his Gallic allies, the Aedui, led now by Divitiacus, to invade the lands of the Bellovaci, a powerful Belgae tribe, to open a second front, while he marched towards the Belgic alliance's main army. Caesar crossed a bridge over the Axona River and encamped in a strong position on a hill on the other side. The river provided protection from the rear, and marshy land at his front made a frontal assault difficult.
So the river can provide protection to the rear. It can also be your downfall if you're up against a river and you start to lose and you can't retreat back across it. So it can work either way. It can work in your favor or it can work against you.
Furthermore, Caesar had learned his lesson from fighting Ariovistus and left 6 cohorts in a well-fortified position on the other side of the bridge, securing his supply line.
So let's take a minute and talk about the how the Roman army is organized. So, we're talking about legions, we're talking about cohorts, there's these different groups. So let's just take a minute and talk about what that looks like. Okay, so here you go. This is kind of the way it breaks down, and these numbers vary just like they would in any war, depending on troop strength and the time period you're talking about and things like that. But basically, the Roman legion being kind of the largest group that you're dealing with in a Roman army, and one legion's going to number anywhere, sometimes from 3,000 all the way up to 6,000 soldiers, but typically around 5,500. And then you can see how a legion's broken down. You've got 10 cohorts in a legion with cavalry available as well. A cohort is going to be made up of 6 centuries. And then a century is around 80 soldiers, sometimes up to 100. That's where you get the term century for 100 years. And a centurion would be in charge of one of these units. Cohort, so there you kind of have the breakdown. Century would be similar to a modern company, though a little bit smaller than that. A cohort, think of it like a battalion, looking at 500, 600, 700 men, and then an entire legion. You're talking about, in the American Civil War, this is the size of a division. More modern day, you're looking at something like a couple of regiments, or a couple of brigades, I guess, because we don't really use regiments too much anymore. But that gives you somewhat of an idea if you're familiar with other time periods, to kind of just let you know how things get broken down.
With no chance of being starved out from his position, Caesar waited for the Belgae to make their move. Meanwhile, the Belgae had marched to the Remi town of Bibrax, just 8 miles from where Caesar was encamped, and besieged it. Caesar gives the total number of the confederation as 300,000. However, it is unclear how much this number is exaggerated and how many of these men were currently in the army.
So this is one of the challenges that historians always face when trying to analyze these things. History is often told by the victors, and it's often exaggerated to make the victors look better. So most of this information we're getting about how these battles went down and what the numbers were like is coming from Caesar directly, from his own source, from him as the source. And so people take that with a grain of salt, assuming that Caesar may have inflated the enemy numbers to make it look like he completed a greater challenge. So we really don't know for sure what these numbers look like. We can only estimate.
A more realistic estimation would be somewhere around 80,000 men. Still a force to be reckoned with, almost double that of Caesar's. In the face of such a large force, the Remi sent messages to Caesar saying that they would be unable to hold the town without his help. Caesar, however, was reluctant to give up his defensive position, as he thought that the attack on Bibrax was a trap designed to force him to do that. Instead, he kept his legions in camp, but sent a substantial contingent of auxiliaries, composed mainly of Cretan archers and Balearic slingers, to sneak into Bibrax to help the Remi. With Bibrax thus reinforced, and Caesar not taking the bait, Galba instead marched his army to meet the Romans, encamping just 2 miles from the Roman camp. Caesar was reluctant to engage Galba straight away, and instead focused on cavalry skirmishes to test the strength of the Belgae. While this was going on, he further reinforced his position, digging long trenches and constructing defensive towers on the flanks of his position.
And as we talked about yesterday, Caesar made regular use of fortifications. This is something he did whenever possible. His men serving under him would have been as comfortable building fortifications and towers as they would have been fighting in battle. This was a regular part of what they had to do.
Realizing that attacking such a strong position would be suicidal, Galba instead sent roughly 15,000 to 20,000 men to ford the river and attack the 6 cohorts on the other side, hoping either to draw Caesar from the hill or to cut off his supply line and starve him out.
So again, 6 cohorts, we're talking about, let's say, 6 battalions. So we're talking about maybe 3,000 men, a little more than half of one of Caesar's legions. This is a small part of his force.
Seeing this, Caesar gathered all his light infantry and cavalry and marched quickly to oppose the crossing, leaving his legions in their defensive position. The Roman cavalry arrived just in time and fell upon the few Belgae who had made it to the other bank, killing many and forcing them back into the river. At the same time, the Roman missile troops peppered the Belgae still in the water with stones, javelins and arrows. They doggedly tried to continue their crossing despite taking heavy casualties, but Galba had no choice but to pull his men back. To make matters worse, word had now reached him that the Aedui were rampaging through the Bellovaci lands.
So any good commander, and Caesar is certainly one of those ones that has to be in the conversation for the greatest, among the greatest certainly, any good commander is going to create the conditions that favor him on the battlefield and force the enemy into a battle of his choosing rather than what the enemy wants to do. And so what Caesar has done here is by using his main force behind this fortification, which is then behind a body of water, he's forcing the enemy to have no choice but to abandon the idea of a frontal assault with his heavier numbers and to try to cross somewhere else and get around those fortifications, which is exactly what Caesar wanted him to do, which allows him then to isolate and destroy smaller numbers of troops.
With the Romans to his front so heavily dug in, and with another army now threatening his flank, Galba decided to withdraw. The
Smart.
tribes would all disperse to their respective homelands, but all agreed to reassemble if the Romans marched further into Belgae lands.
And this is wise on the part of the Belgae. They realize that the conditions have been created in such a way that do not favor them, and so rather than fighting anyway, they withdraw, which is the wise move.
As the Confederation's army dispersed, Caesar cautiously pursued with his cavalry and 3 legions under Labienus harassing the Belgae. Due to their lack of coordination, the Belgae suffered heavy casualties in this retreat. The battle had cost the Confederation approximately 10,000 men and had forced the tribes to divide, making them easier for Caesar to conquer. Many tribes simply surrendered in the face of the Roman legions, including the Bellovaci and Galba's Suessiones. However, deeper in Belgae territory, the Nervii did have the time to organize and were not going to give up so easily.
And I believe, it's been a while since I read about this, I believe these are the people that pushed Caesar to the breaking point and nearly defeat him in battle.
They were outraged by Caesar's foray into Belgae territory, and alongside their neighbours, the Virumandui, Atrebates, and Aduatuci, were able to gather an army of approximately 50,000 men, led by the Nervii king, Boducnatus.
It might be one of Caesar's greatest challenges here.
Caesar, hearing that this force was gathering against him, marched for the river Sabis on the edge of Nervii territory. Boducnatus had learned the lesson from Galba and knew that he could not allow the Romans the chance to fortify their position.
See, there you go. I've said it repeatedly. These were not stupid people that Caesar was fighting against. And that means you got to give a lot of credit to Caesar for winning these battles. These were good leaders. These were solid tacticians in some cases. They learned their lesson. You don't let Caesar build fortifications and force you into a situation that favors him. You've got to deal with him before he gets that opportunity.
And so he positioned his men in ambush on a hill on the other side of the river. He also had his troops construct hedge-like obstructions, which were placed on the other side of the river to disrupt the Roman formations and cavalry. Caesar marched his army in 2 groups. His veteran 6 legions, who marched in the front, were the first to reach the river and began constructing a camp on the hill with the river in front, while the 2 newer legions marched behind with the baggage train. Caesar sent his cavalry and light infantry across the river, which was only 3 feet deep, in order to scout the opposite bank. They were met by some Nervii cavalry, and a brief skirmish broke out. However, the Belgae cavalry fell back, drawing in the Romans until the entire Nervii force broke cover and fell upon them. The Roman cavalry and light infantry broke and ran back across the river to the Roman camp, the Nervii army in hot pursuit. Thus started the Battle of the Sabis River. The Belgae moved from the woods and across the river so fast that the legions had almost no time to prepare.
It's what you have to do against Caesar.
Their experience and discipline kicked in. Rallying to the nearest cohort and legionary standards, they were able to put together a coherent battle line.
And this is where your training comes in so important. They knew what to do in this situation. They knew how to quickly organize, how to rally around their standards, how to rally around their officers, and they were able to get in position despite being caught off guard.
But as the legionary engineers did not have time to clear the campsite as they usually would, the legions were divided by the hedge-like obstructions laid down by Boducnatus, which prevented them from forming a cohesive formation. As a result, the legions were almost fighting 3 separate battles, the 10th and the 9th on the left against the Atrebati, the 11th and 8th in the centre against the Virumandui, and the 12th and 7th on the right against the largest group, the Nervii, with 2 remaining legions still with the baggage train yet to join the battle.
And can we once again just talk about how amazing it is that a battle that took place more than 2,000 years ago, we have so much detail. We know who was on what flank and what position they held, who they were fighting against. This is incredible stuff that was passed down to us from Caesar's reports and from the things that he wrote about these battles. Now remember, Caesar's not writing this, I don't think, because he's concerned about telling a good history. He's writing this because he wants to tell people how great Caesar is. But it doesn't hurt that it got passed down to us, and so we have a good account of these things.
The fighting was brutal, with Caesar himself going from group to group, encouraging his men. Eventually, the Roman left was able to push their enemy back enough to hurl their javelins into their ranks and charge. They were able to force the Atrebati back across the river, even making it into the Belgae camp. The Roman centre was also finding success, pushing the Virimandui down to the banks of the river. However, the Roman right was having a hard time. With the centre pushing forwards, the Nervii poured into the gap, almost surrounding the 12th and 7th legions and falling upon the auxiliaries who had retreated to the camp. The remaining auxiliaries, including most of the Roman cavalry who had been marching in front of the baggage train, saw this and fled, assuming the Roman right had been completely destroyed and the battle lost. They were not without reason. The 12th had lost their standard, their chief centurion, most of the other centurions, and the Romans were beginning to break.
So, to put this in perspective, again, the standard is like your battle flag. This is a big deal. This is a matter of prestige and honor. It's also the thing you're rallying around. Most of your centurions have been killed, so these are your company commanders, so to speak. So you're losing a lot of command and control on the battlefield. This is a nightmare scenario right now for the Romans.
Seeing this disaster, Caesar knew he would have to do something or risk losing the whole campaign. Snatching up a shield, he pushed himself to the front line of the legion, bolstering the morale of the men. With the 7th Legion under heavy pressure as well, Caesar ordered them to form a defensive square with the 12th and hold their ground. At this point, the battle began to swing in the Romans' favour. Labienus, in charge of the 10th and 9th legions, saw what was happening from the other side of the river and sent the 10th to relieve the Roman right, while the remaining 2 legions had finally joined the battle and were attacking the Nervii in the Roman camp.
So we've talked before about the importance of having reserves, about having additional resources you can call upon, whereas in most of these battles, these tribes have had to commit their entire force to try and have a chance. Caesar doesn't have to do that, and once again, having those additional troops turns the tide.
Roman auxiliary cavalry also returned to the battle, seeing this change in fortune, and now it was the Nervii who faced disaster. The Virimandui had fled upon seeing the Roman reinforcements, and the Nervii were now surrounded. They fought bravely, and even Caesar commended them later, but their defeat was now inevitable. The Belgae casualties were devastating, Caesar saying that just 500 survived the battle. The Roman losses had also been high, with perhaps as many as 5,000 Romans dead.
So it seems to most of these battles, it ends up around 5,000. So I don't know if Caesar's just reporting the numbers that way, and he always seems to kind of settle on 5,000. But you got to remember, 5,000, that's an entire legion. Those are not small numbers when you have perhaps 40,000 men, and you keep losing that many. But I think most of the estimates I've read for this battle have the numbers for the opposing force, the deaths at somewhere around 35 to 40,000. I think Caesar said 70, which would have been most of their army.
Without Caesar's personal leadership and the timely interventions of the legions, it is likely that the battle would have been lost, Caesar killed, and the campaign ended.
Yep.
But the battle was over, and Caesar was once again victorious. The Nervii surrendered, becoming a vassal of Rome, and the Atrebati were conquered soon after. Rome was now in control of most of Gaul.
All right, we're going to wrap it up right there. A lot, once again, to take in, and I'm continuing to try and consume all I can about Roman things right now in between when I have time. But I'm trying to record some of these ahead of time because I'm going to be out of town all next week, and I want to continue to have daily content available for you. So there's a good chance, at least in some of these cases, that by the time you see this video, I will have already recorded the next one. So I may not be able to respond to your comments and things like that in the next video, but I will respond. And as always, I do read every single comment on every single video. So thank you for those. Please hit that like button, subscribe if you're new to the channel and you like what you see. We'll see you again tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, to part 3 of my reaction to Kings and Generals Caesar in Gaul. I hope you've enjoyed the first 2 episodes of this reaction series. If you have not seen those, there's a link in the description that will take you back to the beginning of episode 1. There's also a link for the original content creator. Please make sure you check them out. They've got a lot of fantastic historical content on their channel that is definitely worth your time. A couple quick announcements I want to let you know about. Number 1, I have started a Total War Rome remastered series. My first episode just went live on my gaming channel. There's a link in the description to that. And one more link, that makes 4, that I want to tell you about. Actually, there's a couple of other things I want to tell you about. Number 1, I've got a stream coming at 2 p.m. today. So if you're seeing this, it's already coming up. If you missed any stream, all of our streams stay live on the channel afterwards, so you'll be able to check that out. We're going to be talking about July 2nd, the Battle of Gettysburg, today on the anniversary of the second day of the battle, and we'll do the same with another stream tomorrow on July 3rd. And then the last thing I want to tell you about is my grandfather, who raised me, so he's really the only father that I've had growing up. Has had music a huge part of his life, and therefore music has been a big part of my life. And I've collaborated with my grandfather and a couple of his former bandmates, and we're working on a project where we're going to be doing some live shows on YouTube. There'll be some weekly shows coming up, probably sometime late August, early September is when the first one will go up. But we put up a little promo video and set up the channel. And I put a link in the description if you want to check that out. I posted an announcement about it yesterday. Just something a little fun on the side that we're doing. So I posted a link with a promo video just showing us kind of practicing and warming up with some of the stuff we're going to be doing in our first show. So check that out if you're interested in music. All right, let's dive in to the next part, part 3 of Caesar in Gaul.
By 56 BC, Caesar had subjugated the majority of Gaul, either through conquest or political alliances, and was beginning to look for new opportunities to expand Rome's influence. But not all the Gallic tribes were taking kindly to Roman rule. One such tribe was the Veneti, located in modern Brittany. Despite signing a peace treaty with Caesar the year before, they reneged on this promise and captured a few Roman officers. As a largely seafaring nation, the Veneti were confident that they would be able to put their faith in their navy and force Caesar to make concessions. However, Caesar spent no time trying to negotiate, instead seeing the act as a direct declaration of war, and marched on the tribe. Initially, he found little success. Due to their large navy, the Veneti were able to effectively hop from town to town, moving entire populaces and their belongings, denying the Romans a pitched battle or siege.
So play into their strengths. That's exactly what you need to do when you're going up against someone as mighty as Rome is. But I feel like you could probably only do that for so long. At some point you're going to need food. At some point you're going to need things that can only be provided by staying in one place for a little while. So be interested to see where this goes.
Standard Roman tactics proved ineffective, therefore, and it was clear that, in order to win, Caesar had to defeat the navy. With no navy on hand, he ordered that a fleet be built in order to take on the Veneti navy.
So we talked yesterday a little bit about how Caesar's men had to be engineers too, because in a lot of these battles, and especially when he comes up against in the huge battle that will define the Gallic Wars, he's had to build entire walls, entire cities of settlements, and fortifications were a regular thing. Now they've got to build a navy too.
But compared to the Roman ships, which were designed for the Mediterranean, the Veneti ships, designed for the Atlantic, were much stronger and taller, and the Romans found them impossible to ram or board. It was only through the ingenuity of one of his legates, Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, who suggested that they use billhooks to cut down the sails and cripple the Veneti boats, that Caesar was able to defeat their navy. With this issue sorted, it now seemed that Caesar would be able to move on to new conquests. Once again though, his plans were put on hold in 55 BC, when yet another roaming German horde, composed of Usipetes and Tenchtheri, began threatening the Rhine border.
So, one of the parallels that you'll notice with Caesar and someone else who conquered much of these same territories in Napoleon is that when your victories are in large part due to the brilliance of your general, the general kind of has to be everywhere. You know, he can't send other forces to deal with these things. He can't spread out. You're trying to subjugate a populace that vastly outnumbers you, which means you've got to keep your army together but bounce from one place to another and go to meet those new threats. And, you know, it becomes tiresome after a while. It becomes difficult after a while. But that's what Caesar's having to do, much like what Napoleon had to do, bouncing from Spain to Austria to Russia to Prussia, kind of moving all over wherever the current threat was.
These tribes previously rivaled the Suebi, but were now fleeing in huge numbers, Caesar giving their total number, including civilians, as 430,000. They had already slaughtered the Menapii and stolen their ships in order to cross the river, and were now pouring into Gaul. Upon hearing about this, Caesar was once again compelled to act, as he was worried that the Gauls might join the Germans in an attempt to oust the Romans. Some Gallic tribes in the Rhine Valley had indeed sent emissaries to the Germans, providing them with food and intelligence, encouraging them to move deeper into Gaul. Caesar gathered a council of Gallic chiefs and convinced them to provide more cavalry for him to confront the Germans.
And remember that, you know, thinking down the road, I mean, we're what, 55 BC, thinking down the road even hundreds of years, the Germanic tribes were tribes that the Romans never fully did conquer. They won battles against them, they subjugated some of the border tribes at different times, but they never did fully conquer the Germanic peoples, and they continued to be a threat that eventually is a big participant in Rome's downfall.
This served two purposes. Firstly, Rome's cavalry had always been lacking, and the Gauls were renowned horsemen, and so filled a crucial role in the army. And secondly, because cavalry was composed largely of nobles or wealthy persons, they would act as hostages, ensuring good behaviour. He then gathered 5 of his legions and headed to the Rhine.
So 5 legions, we're talking 25,000 men, you know, legion being around 5,000.
The Germans had sent a portion of their cavalry ahead of their main force in order to carry out raiding missions, but hearing that Caesar was getting close, they sent emissaries in order to delay him. They asked Caesar to negotiate, claiming that they were only in Gaul because they had been forced to flee from the Suebi, and promised to ally with Rome if Caesar could provide them with land in Gaul. However, Caesar suspected that the Germans were delaying and continued his advance.
And this is something that the Germanic tribes do regularly. They try to use negotiations not as a way of avoiding battle, but as a way of stalling to buy themselves time, or as a way of trying to trick them. Remember that previous to this, there had been an attempt to get Caesar to come to a second meeting so that they could capture or kill him, and he didn't buy it. So Caesar's wise to their plans.
The envoys continued back and forth as Caesar continued to progress towards the German camp, sending forward his 5,000 cavalry as an advanced force, but with orders not to provoke them into attack. However, upon seeing the Roman cavalry separated from the main force, the Germans fell upon them. The Romans initially tried to hold their ground, but were eventually overwhelmed and retreated to the safety of Caesar's camp. Caesar likely underplays the amount of casualties taken, giving the number as 74, but he does mention that 2 brothers of the famous and influential Piso family had died in the fighting, something that Caesar could not let go unpunished. Refusing to hold back any longer, Caesar gathered his force to attack the Germans. But before he moved off, the Germans sent a party of diplomats, including high-ranking nobility, to treat with Caesar, once again asking for peace and apologizing for the attack. As the Germans had already attacked apparently without provocation, Caesar refused and took the delegates as prisoners. He then drew up his army in 3 lines and moved swiftly to the German camp. The Germans, assuming that Caesar still would have been delayed by their envoys, were caught completely unaware.
Wow. So they're trying to delay, and then they get beat by their own tactic because they think the delay's working. And did they not have scouts or somebody watching to see that Caesar was coming with his army? I can't believe they could have gotten so totally caught off guard.
The legions fell upon their camp. Caesar brushes over the details, but it seems to have been somewhat of a massacre. The fleeing Germans were pursued by the Roman cavalry. Some made it across the river in their boats, but many tried to swim across and drowned. Hearing of the defeat, the German cavalry, which had been pillaging, returned across the Rhine. Caesar's army had taken minimal casualties. It is important to note that while Caesar portrayed this as a great victory against a marauding Germanic horde, this is not how others saw it. To Caesar's political rivals in Rome, Caesar had broken the armistice with the Germans by antagonizing them with his cavalry, imprisoned diplomats, which was effectively a declaration of war, and then carried out a massacre, including civilians.
So, a declaration of war on a group of people that had already attacked your cavalry? I don't know about that. But, remember, while Caesar's winning all these great victories, he is hundreds of miles from Rome. And so he doesn't necessarily have the ability to also be in Rome pleading his case. Because remember, Caesar is also a political leader, and he's from a powerful, noble family. So there's always this politics that go along with all of this too. And, all of these men, as many of you mentioned, Crassus, who's part of his triumvirate that he had been a part of, has also been a military leader. Pompey is known as Pompey Magnus because of his great military victories. But being in Rome always gives you a political advantage over a guy who may be winning victories, but is hundreds of miles away.
Caesar needed something to distract the Senate and win the minds of the people. So he decided to boost his popularity by doing what no Roman general had ever done before, crossing the Rhine. The Germanic tribe Ubii offered its ships, hoping that the Romans would assist in their war against the Suebi.
So Caesar has always got one mind on military tactics and one mind on politics, political, how things are viewed. Propaganda. That's a big reason why he wrote all this stuff down and he kept track of it, is that he knew it could be a powerful tool to use to win over the populace. You're always worried about the will of the people and the popularity of the people, who the people think is popular at any given time. So sometimes his military tactics are going to be driven by what's going to sell really well back in Rome.
Caesar, however, deemed this unworthy of the Roman people, and instead decided to build a bridge across the Rhine between modern Andernach and Neuwied. It was an engineering marvel. The legion's engineers used winches to act as pile drivers, driving stakes deep into the river, and constructed the 140 to 400 meter by 7 to 9 meter bridge in just 10 days.
Wow. So he's got some brilliant engineers with him. I mean, some of the stuff they're pulling off, the fortifications, the building a navy that can defeat a seafaring people, and now building this massive bridge over the Rhine River. Impressive stuff.
Caesar found the lands beyond the Rhine almost deserted. Taken aback by the Roman speed and their feat of engineering, the Germanic tribes in the area had retreated deep into the Germanic forests, where they had amassed a significant army. However, Caesar had no desire to be caught in a prolonged campaign in foreign territory against a notoriously dangerous enemy. He spent just 18 days on the German side of the Rhine, burning villages and crop fields before returning and dismantling the bridge.
So this was really just all about political theater. This is propaganda. This is, look, Caesar crossed the Rhine and did some damage to the Germanic tribes on the other side of the Rhine. Now let's get back across before we get into a disaster with our army.
The campaign was a proof, not only to the Germans but also to Caesar's rivals in Rome, that he could overcome anything and do as he pleased. Caesar's next ambition, Britain, was once again a perfect propaganda target. The island was on the edge of the known world and rumoured to be a land of monsters and vast riches. It had remained effectively untouched, and bringing it into Rome's sphere of influence would be a significant achievement. According to Caesar, the Britons had provided some of the Gallic tribes with the resources needed to make war. While this was a weak casus belli, Caesar was, by now, effectively doing what he wanted with...
Yeah, he's really stretching it now to try and give himself a cause for war. The Britons are supporting our enemies, and so now I've got to go deal with them. This is all about the glory of Caesar at this point, and winning more glory for him and his men, and spreading the empire even further. This has nothing to do with a just cause for war.
Little oversight. He began gathering intel from the Gallic merchants and sent a small reconnaissance force to the island, whilst he mustered the ships he used against the Veneti and prepared to cross with the 7th and 10th Legion. He set sail from modern Calais and safely made it across with most of his army, but his cavalry had been delayed by bad weather. The Romans saw the Britons had amassed along the White Cliffs of Dover in huge numbers, with infantry, cavalry and chariots, and with every warrior painted in fierce blue war paint. Caesar moved further down the coast in order to find a better place to land, but was shadowed by the Britons' cavalry and chariots, who were easily able to keep pace with the fleet. When the Romans finally found a suitable beach, Caesar arranged his transport vessels into a long line with his warships on his flanks and ordered his men to disembark. As the transport vessels had deep keels, however, they were still some way from the shore, and the legions were forced to wade in waist deep in water to try and reach the beach. The Britons saw their opportunity and attacked, firing missiles into the ranks of the legionnaires as they struggled through the water, weighed down by their armour.
This is like landing on the beaches at Normandy, right? You don't want to be the first guy off the boat in the lead of this thing. You want to be back further when they're able to push in a little bit. Man, that must have just been brutal.
The Briton cavalry charged in and out of the Romans, the height advantage of being on horseback, allowing them to fight much more effectively than the Romans stuck in the water. The legionaries were taking significant casualties, and seeing this, Caesar moved his shallower-keeled warships up the flanks so that his missile troops and ballistae could fire into the Britons' sides.
Use your technology.
Still, the legions were wavering, with some men not even being willing to get off their transports. It was not until an eagle-bearer of the 10th Legion leapt into the water and waded towards the Britons that the legions rallied and rejoined the battle in earnest.
So eagle bearer is basically your flag bearer, your standard bearer, right? I mean, this is the guy who is going to rally the troops and inspire confidence and inspire that desire to fight that you want from your standard bearer. So this is the kind of thing that these battles turn on when it's hand-to-hand combat.
The fighting was fierce and contested, with the Romans gathering to their nearest standards to try and maintain some form of cohesion, while Caesar used rowing boats to ferry men from the transports to areas where the Roman front line looked to be in danger. Finally, the Romans were able to push through the shallows onto the beach, where their organisation and heavy armour could come into play, at which point the Britons broke off and retreated. Caesar, without any cavalry, had no choice but to let them escape. We don't know the numbers of dead on either side, but being a contested landing, it's likely that the Roman losses were greater.
Yep, no doubt.
Following the battle, the Romans established a camp on the beach, and the Britons sent delegates to sue for peace, probably to assess the Romans' purpose in the area. They were on home ground and could afford to wait to see what Caesar's next move would be, whereas Caesar, with no supply line, would be pressured to make the first move.
Interesting, because I would have thought that as the Britons, that once he establishes himself, especially if he doesn't have cavalry yet, that I'd send my infantry and I'd try to push him back off that beach. Kind of like what the strategy would have been for the Germans at Normandy, is that, you know, they knew that if the Allies were able to establish themselves and then start to push inland, that it would be over with. The only chance they really had was to be able to counterattack and push them back off the beach right away.
Caesar accepted the peace, and the Britons sent a small number of hostages, promising more later. The cavalry that had been waylaid did try and cross once again to meet Caesar, but were caught in a storm and forced to turn back. This same storm damaged the ships that Caesar had anchored off the beach, demoralizing the Romans, who could no longer escape the island.
No way to get back.
Salvaging what materials he could from the most damaged ships, Caesar began repairs. He sent one legion at a time to forage for food, whilst the others defended the camp on the beach. However, whilst one of the legions was out foraging, the camp watch reported seeing dust on the horizon moving their way. This, combined with the lack of the promised extra hostages, was enough to alert Caesar to what was happening. He gathered 2 cohorts and marched quickly to the legion's location. Whilst foraging, the legion had been ambushed. Scattered and focused on collecting food, the Britons had been able to kill a substantial number of them in the initial attack. The legion had managed to regain some level of discipline, snatching up their weapons, but they were surrounded by the British cavalry and chariots.
Oh boy.
British charioteers were trained to throw missiles from their chariots and then dismount to fight on foot, before hopping back on the chariot when the fighting got too hard in order to regroup. This gave them the staying power of infantry and mobility of cavalry, a tactic Caesar admired, but was now taking a heavy toll on the surrounded legion. Upon Caesar's arrival with his cohorts in formation, the cavalry and chariots retreated. The Britons had no desire to fight heavy infantry in formation in a pitched battle without their own infantry support, and allowed the legion to withdraw to camp with Caesar. However, bolstered by this success, the Britons amassed their full force of infantry, cavalry and chariots and marched on the camp.
That's what I'd do too.
Caesar drew out his legions to meet them. So far, he had been fighting in difficult circumstances, in water, in ambushes, against a highly mobile enemy. But this was an ideal situation for the Romans, where their formations and discipline could truly make a difference. The Britons charged, but in these conditions, the Romans had a significant advantage. Whilst the chariots and cavalry had proved highly effective against small groups of Roman infantry, with the legions in a cohesive line, they now had little effect. The Britons quickly caught on to this fact and disengaged, their chariots and cavalry leaving the battlefield.
I'll give the Britons credit. Once they figured out that it was not an ideal situation for them in this battle, they disengaged. They didn't keep pressing. They didn't get themselves annihilated. They're looking for favorable situations to try and take advantage of, and when they don't have it, they pull back. That's a good, smart strategy.
The Roman infantry was now able to surge forward and catch a portion of the Briton infantry, routing it completely. The Britons were excellent at hit-and-run tactics and ambushes, but in set-piece battles, the Romans were far superior.
Alright, I think we're going to wrap it up right there. I know we're still in the middle of the story of the invasion of Britain, but that'll give us somewhere to pick up when we come back tomorrow. Let me know your thoughts. Make sure you check out all of those links I talked about at the beginning. They're all down below in the description of the video. And we will see you later on today with our stream about Gettysburg, and then tomorrow with the next part of this series. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everybody, to my reaction series to Caesar in Gaul by Kings and Generals. And once again, a big thank you to Kings and Generals, who are now subscribe to this channel, so welcome. And I highly encourage every single one of you to subscribe to their channel. There's a link in the description to this original content. Let's give them all the credit for their great and difficult work to put this together. Check out their videos. They've got a lot of fantastic content. This is an opportunity for us to have a conversation about this period in history, and we're using this great resource that is available to do that. So please make sure you give them a like, give them a comment, and subscribe. We're picking up right where we left off. We're in the middle of Caesar's invasion of Britain, which has been kind of a mixed bag so far. Didn't start off well, starting to do a little better, but we'll see where it goes. And we'll probably do this in 2 more parts, so we'll do about half of what's left today, pick up with the rest tomorrow.
Once again, the Britons sent a peace delegation, and Caesar, knowing that his options were limited and that he did not have enough resources to carry out a full campaign, accepted and then hastily withdrew from the island during the night. However, on his way back to Gaul, 2 ships were blown off course in a storm. 300 Romans were stranded and surrounded by a Belgae tribe, the Morini, who Caesar had only recently subjugated and were keen for spoils and revenge. The Romans were assailed from all sides with missiles in hit-and-run attacks against their small group. Caesar caught wind of this and gathered as much cavalry as he could to personally lead them to the men's rescue, managing to ride down the Gauls and save the Romans with only minimal casualties.
This is the kind of thing right here that gives your men great confidence in you as a commander, and also instills in them pride and a desire to be willing to follow you anywhere. He could have let those 300 men go and just said, you know what, we lost them. It was an unfortunate incident. I'm not risking any of my men to go after them. But he rides personally to their rescue and bails out what's left of them. That's a big, big deal in terms of inspiring confidence in the men that you command.
Labienus would later be sent into the Belgae territory to winter there and reinforce Roman rule in the area. Neither the invasion of Britain nor this foray into Belgae territory were significant military achievements. However, they show why Caesar was so loved by his men. He was brave, achieving things no Roman had ever done before. He was calm under pressure, and most importantly, he would lead from the front and showed that he cared for his soldiers and was prepared to risk his life to save them.
And remember, this is a time in history, well, much of history is defined by times like these, where you have multiple classes of people, and Caesar is part of that nobility class that exists in Rome. Now, Rome's a republic, I get that, but Rome very much had these classes of nobility, and the family he comes from, the Julii family, is one of the most renowned, certainly not the very top of society in Rome, but it's right up there. And for him to get down and dirty with the men, to lead from the front, to fight with them, shows them that he is the common man's general. He's not above them. He's not better than them. And I think that probably went a long way to why he was able to get them to fight.
The Britain campaign had not achieved much for the Romans, but it did provide Caesar with crucial knowledge about the Britons' military, the climate, and the level of preparation that he would need to succeed, lessons he would learn from for next year. Moreover, the Roman public and Senate were amazed by his feat of crossing the Channel into unknown territories, and a full 20 days of Thanksgiving were declared to recognize his achievement. After dealing with some administrative matters in 54 BC, Caesar began planning a second campaign in Britain. Almost 600 transports and 28 warships were built, implementing Veneti shipbuilding techniques better suited to the rough seas. Caesar called on his Gallic allies and vassals and amassed 4,000 cavalry, including tribal leaders.
So let's back up for a second and talk about this shipbuilding, because they've learned from their earlier mistakes. Remember when he had the naval battle earlier, and he had ships that were more suited for the river, suited for the coast, not really suited for seafaring. He's learned from that, and he's learned his engineers have learned about shipbuilding and how to make a ship that can withstand these rougher seas, especially things like crossing the channel. And so this is an important thing when you're conquering other peoples, is to learn from them and to take the strengths of those people and what they do well and add it to what you do well.
Once again bolstering his army and minimizing the risk of revolts in Gaul. He left half of his cavalry and 3 legions in Gaul and crossed with 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry, more than double his previous numbers.
So again, 5 legions, we're talking 25, 30,000 men at most that he's taking with him. So, I mentioned this in previous episodes. If you want to try and easily think of how this goes in your mind, imagine a legion being like the size of a pretty decent sized army division during the American Civil War. We're talking 4,000 to 6,000 men. Think of a cohort as being like a battalion, maybe 400 to 600 men.
This was going to be a full invasion. Caesar landed at the same place as before, but this time he was unopposed. He quickly established a camp in the area and sent out scouts, who promptly brought back some local prisoners. They informed Caesar that a large army had actually gathered to oppose the landing, but had retreated upon seeing the size of Caesar's force. Leaving a legion at the camp, he immediately set out in search of the Briton army. The Romans marched through the night and were able to catch up to the Britons in a hill fort on the other side of a river. Although the Romans were tired, Caesar was determined to confront the Britons and began crossing. The Britons' cavalry and chariots rushed down from the high ground to harass the Romans as they crossed.
Now, if I'm just looking at this on the surface, not really knowing the numbers exactly on either side, I mean, I know what Caesar's got. He left a legion behind, so he's probably got 20,000 men here. The Britons have all the advantages, right? They're on a hill fort. They're defending. Caesar's got to cross a river. He's got to attack uphill. And the Britons are also kind of taking advantage of this, and they're attacking down the hill. So they seem to have all the advantages here.
Caesar's allied Gallic cavalry were experienced in fighting in such scenarios and proved their value, chasing off the Britons, who quickly retreated to the woods surrounding the fort. As the legions began their advance up the hill, they were harassed from the woods by the Britons, preventing them from making significant progress until the 12th Legion formed a testudo and were able to make a rudimentary rampart in order to move over the walls. The Romans were now inside the fortifications, but the Britons were quick to escape the fort and retreated deeper into the woods. Considering the men had carried out a night march and battle, and that he did not know the terrain and whether any more Britons would be waiting for him, Caesar made camp for the night. The next day, word reached him that a storm in the night had again damaged his ships. Without the ships, Caesar would be at the mercy of the Britons, so he decided to prioritize overseeing their repairs.
So everything he's just gained, he's now lost. He's got to pull back out of the fort. He's got to give up the ground he just fought so hard to take. That had to have been demoralizing for the men.
He commanded his army to reassemble and march back to the beach. Upon arriving, he discovered that 40 ships were beyond repair, but the rest were salvageable. Caesar ordered that the ships be brought onto the beach, and a large wall was constructed encompassing the camp and the ships. He also sent word to Labienus to build more ships in Gaul. He then set off once again to find the Britons. They were in the same hill fort, but it was a larger force than before, under the command of Cassivellaunus, a tribal leader beyond the Thames, who was appointed the leader of a united coalition against the Romans.
So this is brilliant now on the part of the Britons. They have banded together against a common enemy. There's a lot of different tribes here that you're dealing with, just like you deal with the Gauls and with the Belgians and others. But they're smart. They're not going to fight against each other. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. We need to focus right now on the invader, and let's join together. And they even managed to appoint somebody in command over them. These are all winning strategies. Let's see what happens.
Caesar had marched past this fort, possibly not wanting to attack such a large and fortified enemy, instead attacking exposed villages to try and draw Cassivellaunus out. At the same time, his troops were constantly harassed by the Britons' cavalry and chariots fighting skirmishes with the Roman cavalry on the flanks, luring them into the forests before turning back to inflict significant casualties. The Britons seemingly allowed the Roman advance party time to begin making a fort for the night. However, as construction began, the Britons attacked again.
Got surrounded.
The Romans who were on guard were able to form a line to defend the site, but the fighting was brutal, with the Briton chariots darting in and out of the Roman formation. Caesar was forced to send a further 2 cohorts from the vanguard to quickly reinforce this line.
About 1,000 men.
The Romans were not used to the Briton style of fighting, particularly chariot hit-and-run tactics, drawing out the Roman infantry from formation who were too slow to catch them. At one point, the Britons were able to draw out a maniple far enough to create a gap, which they were able to exploit, punching through the Roman line and inflicting many casualties. It was not until the rest of the Roman army caught up that the Britons disengaged and retreated. Cassivellaunus was proving himself a cunning enemy. Caesar marched to the Thames, towards Cassivellaunus's own territories, in an attempt to draw them out. Though he was able to find a position on the river where he could cross, the legions were once again harassed by Britons amassed on the other bank, who quickly retreated once the Romans were on dry land. Cassivellaunus then made the decision to dismiss the vast majority of his army except for 4,000 chariots, likely realizing that fighting a pitched battle against the Roman heavy infantry would be futile. A smaller force would serve him much better in a guerrilla war. It would be easier to hide, faster to move, and need fewer supplies to maintain. Given the fact that he knew the terrain and Caesar did not, this was a smart and calculated move.
Makes sense.
However, Cassivellaunus's previous wars with other Britons had made him many enemies, and his new guerrilla tactics were not popular with the Trinobantes, whose leader Cassivellaunus had previously killed.
So everything we just talked about uniting the forces and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is now going to go by the wayside because one of his enemies is going to befriend the Romans, which this is the kind of thing you have to expect when you've got these warring tribes. Somebody's going to see the opportunity here and say, man, if I just side with the Romans, maybe I can help turn the tide and then I'll be rewarded and maybe they'll put me in charge. You know, who knows what'll happen.
They sent envoys to Caesar, surrendering and promising hostages. The Trinobantes were second in power only to Cassivellaunus himself, and without their support, numerous tribes followed suit, surrendering to Caesar. They also provided critical intel to Caesar, including the location of Cassivellaunus's capital.
That had to have been brutal for him to know that these men have turned and these tribes have gone over to the other side. I mean, this is a huge advantage, especially after he dismissed a big part of his army.
Caesar marched there, another hill fort, burning all villages and fields on the way, and besieged it from both sides, once again hoping to draw the Briton leader into a direct confrontation. Cassivellaunus, however, did not take the bait. Although his guerrilla tactics were effective, they were taking a toll on the Britons, and the defenders within the capital quickly fled. Cassivellaunus realized he needed to gain a victory. Not wanting to fight Caesar directly though, he instead sent envoys to 4 allied kings in Kent, who launched an attack on the Roman camp on the beach in order to try and draw Caesar away from Cassivellaunus's land.
So this is one legion here, so we're talking maybe 5,000 men defending the beach, and if they lose and Caesar loses his ships, he's going to be kind of stuck. He's going to have to build a whole new navy to be able to get back across if it comes to it.
However, the Roman fortifications were strong, and the force Caesar had left on the beach was easily able to repel the attack.
Nice.
Cassivellaunus was forced to sue for peace. Caesar readily accepted in exchange for hostages and tribute. Winter was closing in, and he had no desire to spend it in unknown, hostile lands. The Romans returned to the beach and sailed back to Gaul. Overall, it is hard to see the invasion as an immense military victory. Cassivellaunus had not been decisively defeated in battle nor captured, and the Romans maintained no presence in Britain. From the Briton standpoint, it was a strategic victory, having successfully pushed the Romans out of their lands. Still, his campaigns in Britain had taken 2 years, and without Caesar's presence, Gaul was beginning to stir. In 54 BC, a Gallic tribe, the Eburones, under their leader Ambiorix, successfully revolted in Belgica, ambushing and destroying the 7,000 to 9,000 strong Roman detachment that had been sent to winter in their territory at Attuatica. Following this success, Ambiorix began to besiege the Roman garrison in the Nervii territory, and a general revolt in the area broke out, the Indutio Maris and the Treveri also rising in rebellion and being supported by the Germanic tribes across the Rhine. This was a dangerous position. Caesar had spread his legions across Gaul in order to not put too much strain on the resources of one area, and thus divided, they were vulnerable targets.
Remember, we talked about this, about how when Caesar's not around, just like when Napoleon wasn't around during the Napoleonic Wars, the men that he leaves in charge may not be as capable. They may not be able to unite and defeat an enemy the way they can when he's present. So, we're seeing that play out here. So I'm going to wrap it up right there because we've got about 20 minutes of video left in this series. I'm sure the last part's going to be focused pretty heavily on his fight against Vercingetorix, which is kind of the end of the Gallic Wars. So I'll be curious. That's probably the part of the Gallic Wars I know the most about, and probably a lot of people too, because just it's such a famous battle, and the outcome and everything is well known. So we'll get into that in tomorrow's episode, but let me know your thoughts about everything we just talked about, and we will see you again tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, to my final reaction to Caesar in Gaul by Kings and Generals. I hope you guys have enjoyed this series. We're going to get through the end of the video today. As always, if you have not seen the first several videos of my reaction to this series, there's a link in the description below that'll take you back to the beginning. Also, please make sure to check out Kings and Generals. It's a fantastic channel. It's one of my favorite on YouTube. They also happen to subscribe to our channel now, so I was pretty excited when I saw that. And so we want to make sure that we're giving them credit for all the hard work that they put into this series. So there's a link in the description to their original video. Make sure you subscribe, hit like, and support them all you can. Let's dive right in to part 4.
However, he reacted quickly, marching directly to the besieged legion in Nervii territory, while Labienus fought off the Indutio Maris. Upon seeing Caesar approaching, Ambiorix gave up the siege to face this new threat and was quickly defeated, while almost simultaneously, Labienus was able to successfully repel his opponents. Roman retribution for this revolt was swift and devastating. The Eburones were effectively wiped out, while Ambiorix, according to some sources, left Gaul for Germania.
So that sounds really harsh with a 21st century mind looking back and thinking, man, these people are just fighting for their freedom, and you come along and you wipe them out in retaliation. But you have to think of the mindset of the occupying force as the Romans here. We don't want other people to think they can do this, so we're going to send a message to any other potential threats to our rule. If you rise up against us, you may achieve temporary success, but we will come back with a vengeance. We will bring our might upon you, and we will destroy you. So he's sending that message, do not think about doing this.
To help stabilize the situation, Pompey mobilized 2 more legions, and Caesar himself raised another. He now had almost 50,000 men in Gaul under his command. However, this was only the prelude to something much bigger. In 52 BC, Caesar returned to Italy in order to defuse another political problem, and in the same year, another large-scale revolt started. An Arverni leader, Vercingetorix, who probably knew about the political problems in Rome, had organized an alliance of powerful Gallic tribes that, inspired by Ambiorix, were now seeking independence, and had begun attacking Roman outposts and Roman allies in Gaul.
Now, this is a guy, and you'll hear me pronounce it Vercingetorix. I'm not sure what would be the proper pronunciation. He may be right about that. It's just the way I've always said it. But this is a guy that to this day you can go to South Central France and you will see statues to this man. He is well remembered for a guy that lived over 2,000 years ago and ultimately was defeated by Caesar. He is highly regarded and well remembered amongst all of these Gallic tribes. There's probably nobody better known than Vercingetorix.
Upon hearing this, Caesar quickly returned to Gaul to handle the situation. Going on one of his famous forced marches, he swiftly quelled the Senones and Carnutes by taking their capitals. His next target was one of the largest towns of the Bituriges, Novia Dunum. Vercingetorix attempted to stop Caesar's advance near the city, but the Roman heavy infantry was too much for the Gauls and they were forced to retreat, losing many, which allowed Caesar to take the city. To finish off the Bituriges, he needed to take their capital, Avaricum. At this point, Vercingetorix started employing scorched earth tactics, and the Bituriges joined him by burning down 20 of their towns, every one but Avaricum. The Romans moved against this settlement and besieged it, and although Avaricum was very defensible and Vercingetorix attempted to help its defenders, it fell in less than a month. Caesar slaughtered 40,000 locals and replenished his supplies.
40,000! I mean, his army isn't much larger than that. These are just... it's difficult to kind of comprehend this, but the town I live in is 40,000 people. Imagining an invading force coming in and just wiping out the entire town. It may not seem like a big deal if we're talking about the grand scheme of things in the Roman Empire, but to this part of Gaul, this is generations wiped out at one time.
It was clear for Vercingetorix that he couldn't beat the Romans in the field. Meanwhile, Caesar was eager to end the rebellion before it could spread to other Gallic tribes, so he decided to strike the decisive blow by taking the capital of the Arverni, Gergovia. Leaving some troops in the area, Caesar marched with 25,000 towards this settlement, while Vercingetorix shadowed him. Gergovia was in a very solid defensive position, located on top of a high plateau, and Vercingetorix managed to overtake Caesar and positioned his army on the hills in front of the city. As he had done in previous battles, Caesar hoped to cut his enemy's supply lines in order to force them out of their defensive position, whilst he would be receiving supplies from the Aedui, his Gallic allies.
So once again, as a general, you want to try and shape the circumstances of the battle to favor you. The Gauls here that he's facing have the high ground. They've got the defensive position. You want to force them out of that into a battle of your choosing rather than attacking them where they are ready and ready to fight.
However, the Gauls had occupied a hill overlooking the supply line, from where they could ensure water and grain could be transported into the city. Taking it would therefore be crucial to Caesar's plan. In a quick night attack, he was able to dislodge the Gallic garrison there and station 2 legions on the hill, linking this position with the main Roman camp by a trench. So far, all was going according to plan.
Once again, you see the brilliance of Caesar constantly using engineers and using fortifications. He builds a trench. He doesn't mess around. This is like an overnight thing. He instantly, whenever he's into a position where he's fighting, he instantly tries to shape the ground around him as favorable as possible.
Caesar's allies would supply him from the rear, and Vercingetorix would now be forced to either sacrifice his defensive position in order to re-establish his supply line, or be starved out. However, Vercingetorix had his own plans. He bribed the Aedui, who then also joined the revolt, attacking the Roman supplies and threatening to cut off Caesar and surround him. Once again, Vercingetorix seems to have studied Rome's tactics deeply, as this strategy was one of Caesar's own favourite strategies. Caesar was forced to leave 2 legions to guard the Roman position at Gergovia, and took the other 4 to deal with the Aedui.
So he's had a total of 50,000 men. He's already divided his force in half by sending half of them up to the north to deal with what's going on there. Now he's dividing his force even further. This is exactly what you want as the Gauls, is to split him into 3, and now you can take on a little piece at a time.
Subduing them and forcing them to send 10,000 cavalry back to the siege with him. This revolt had Caesar worried that he might face even more revolts and could soon be encircled by the rebels. He needed to extract his legions from Gergovia and consolidate his troops. However, the situation at the city was not looking good. The 2 legions left to guard the Roman camp had been hard-pressed the entire time Caesar had been gone. Furthermore, Vercingetorix had divided his forces, leaving half to defend and fortify the main Gallic camp in front of the city, and half, led by himself, to fortify positions on the surrounding hills on the Gallic right flank. With a 6-foot wall now in front of the main Gallic camp, and the Gallic fortifications on the hills, Vercingetorix had removed any opportunity for Caesar to encircle him and the city.
So you can see Vercingetorix using a lot of the same tactics that Caesar does, and this is what a smart enemy will do. He'll learn what you do well, he'll imitate that, and hopefully implement it as well as you have. And so he is putting himself in a position where he can best defend his people against what he knows is going to be a very difficult enemy.
Seeing the Gallic forces divided, Caesar saw an opportunity to attack their main camp in order to deal a heavy enough blow to allow his army to retreat unmolested. He sent a diversionary force of 1 legion and some cavalry to the surrounding hills, making a huge amount of noise in order to distract the force commanded by Vercingetorix. Then he quickly and quietly moved his remaining legions up to the Gallic camp, leaving a few cohorts in the smaller camp on the occupied hill, while the Aedui cavalry were sent to flank around the Gallic left by another route. The Romans quickly clambered over the wall and fell upon the Gallic camp. The Romans initially had significant success, pushing the Gauls right up to the walls of the city, but Caesar ordered a withdrawal before the rest of the Gallic force under Vercingetorix could reinforce them. However, only 1 legion, the 10th, heard this order and retreated, the others continuing to press on and assaulting the city itself. Some Romans managed to climb on top of the city walls, but were quickly cut down and thrown back off. Missiles from the city walls fell into the Roman ranks as they fought around the base of the walls. Vercingetorix, realizing what was happening from his position on the surrounding hills, sent the rest of his force, headed by his cavalry, to reinforce the camp. The Roman position was now truly desperate.
Now, what do you do if you're Caesar in this situation? I would think that you have to go in and you have to hit Vercingetorix before he can surround and destroy a couple of legions. You've got to do something. You can't, at this point, things have not gone the way that you anticipated or wanted, but you really have no choice.
The initial Gallic force and the city walls were in front of them. There was no way of cutting a way out by pushing forward, and with Vercingetorix crashing into their flank, the legionaries were under serious pressure and were almost surrounded. The officers did their best to maintain Roman discipline and form a defensive formation. According to Caesar himself, 46 centurions died in this struggle, roughly a quarter of all the centurions present, and so maintaining any solid formation was almost impossible.
So 46 centurions, your centurions are basically your company commanders. So that's a big deal. That's a lot of your kind of middle officer corps. And it would be very difficult to maintain discipline and order in a ordered retreat, trying to fall back under overwhelming forces, losing those men.
the Aedui finally appeared on a hill to the Roman right flank, but the Romans, unable to tell if they were allied or not, broke completely, thinking that they were about to be fully surrounded. Caesar was able to use the 10th Legion and the cohorts that had been stationed in the small camp to cover the retreat, and prevented the Gauls from chasing them down, avoiding the total destruction of his army, and withdrew from the field. In his commentaries, Caesar says that only 700 men were lost in this battle, but this is likely vastly underplaying the situation. Caesar being forced to assemble a rearguard and retreating shows how disastrous the battle was.
And if he lost 46 centurions, it is difficult to believe that he only lost 700 men, though it's certainly possible. It's also possible he lost more than 46 centurions and he was downplaying that too.
And it is likely that the Romans lost thousands, modern estimates suggesting as many as 6,000. While Caesar was fighting a losing battle against Vercingetorix at Gergovia, his best legate, Titus Labienus, was sent to deal with rebellions in northern Gaul. Local Gauls, emboldened by Vercingetorix and led by Camulogenus, were consolidating around modern Paris, which was called Lutetia at that time and was the capital of the Parisii. Labienus had left a legion near Agedincum in order to have a supply line to Caesar and marched with 4 more legions towards Lutetia. His troops took Metlosidum along the way, but their attempts to cross the river Seine were blocked by Camulogenus. Labienus was forced to retreat back to Metlosidum. Luckily for him, his scouts had found another crossing near Metlosidum. He crossed there and moved against the Gauls. However, Camulogenus used Vercingetorix's scorched earth tactic, burning Lutetia and retreating to the swamps beyond. At the same time, Labienus learned about Caesar's defeat at Gergovia, which provoked a big Gallic tribe called Bellovaci, led by Corius, to rebel, so he knew that he had to retreat beyond the Seine and unite with his legion in Agedincum.
None of this is looking good right now. I mean, this seems like a losing battle, and honestly, I would probably go back to the invasion of Britain and say, in hindsight, maybe you overstretched a little bit. Maybe you went a little too far. Maybe you should have just worried about holding on to what you had already taken. We talk all the time about going too far, although usually you can't see that until years later when you look back and you can point to that moment and say, that's where they went too far. In Caesar's case, it all works out in the end, but you could say that about Britain.
Labienus' decision to divide his forces into 3 provoked Camulogenus into attacking him to the south of Lutetia without waiting for the Bellovaci, and in the ensuing battle, the Romans used the fact that their divided forces were closer to each other. Each group supported the other, and the legions managed to defeat the Gauls with ease. Camulogenus was killed in the process, which slowed down the consolidation of the anti-Roman rebellion in northern Gaul. Caesar and Labienus both retreated towards Agedincum, where they united their forces. Meanwhile, more and more Gauls were joining the rebellion, and after the rest of the Aedui joined it, even the Roman province of Narbonensis was attacked by them. Caesar and his 10 legions moved through the Sequani and Lingonese territory to the east, in order to gain a line of retreat to the Roman province of Gallia Transalpina.
So just to give you kind of a sense of what we're talking about here, you can see there's Geneva in modern-day Switzerland. Alesia is right here, which is what we're going to be talking about here soon. And you can kind of see on the map the areas where we're talking about. And there's so much history here that goes back. When we think of Western Europe, we think of the battlefields of World War I and World War II. But the battlefields of Europe are so much more ancient than that. And there's so much history here.
At the same time, Caesar's envoys secured a group of Germanic mercenaries who joined the Roman cavalry. Vercingetorix and his 80,000 tried to attack Caesar when the latter was trying to cross the Vinghiani River, but the Romans were able to stop the attack with ease. It is not clear why, but this minor defeat either disheartened Vercingetorix or showed him that he couldn't win against the Romans in an open battle. so he probably tried to recreate the factors that led to the victory at Gergovia when he retreated to the Mandubii capital of Alesia.
Here we go.
Caesar followed him to the settlement.
This is a crazy battle. Siege.
Alesia was a well-defended city on a hill, and Vercingetorix sent messages to his nearby allies to come to his aid. Vercingetorix was in a strong position. He outnumbered Caesar, commanding a force of up to 80,000 men,
and conventional wisdom, at least in later history, is that you don't lay siege to a superior force. And in fact, you typically want to have something like a 3-to-1 advantage if you're going to lay siege to a city or a fortified position. Caesar is going to lay siege to an army that outnumbers his. So fascinating stuff.
Was surrounded by allies who would be able to quickly send men to reinforce him. From his position, it should be a simple rerun of Gergovia. He would wait on the high ground for his allies to arrive so they could either disrupt the Roman supply lines or attack them in the rear. Caesar had learnt his lesson though. Despite his smaller numbers, he immediately began the work of fully surrounding and besieging Alesia, something which Vercingetorix had been able to prevent him doing at Gergovia. The Romans began constructing a 16-kilometer wall, fully encircling the entire city, complete with palisades, trenches, and towers, hoping to cut off any escape.
So here in this case, Caesar's not going to attack. He's not going to hurl his men at a superior enemy. He's going to starve them out. A 16-kilometer wall. I mean, that's a pretty substantial fortification, and it's only the first one he's going to have to build.
Vercingetorix sent his cavalry out to try and disrupt these works, but the legions were able to form a defensive line to hold them, while the German auxiliaries flanked around the side. The Germans proved to be vital to the Roman cause, and their superior horsemanship forced the Gallic cavalry to retreat back into the city, killing many as they were funneled into the narrow gates. Realizing that he would soon be completely surrounded, Vercingetorix decided to send out what was left of his cavalry at night to sneak past the Roman line and head to the nearby tribes to request reinforcements as soon as possible. Upon completing the first wall, Caesar learned from some Gallic deserters that these messengers had been sent, and so constructed a second wall, this one almost 21 kilometers long and complete with 2 trenches and a moat, facing outwards to protect against any Gallic reinforcements, creating a donut-like structure with Alesia in the center.
Can you maybe there's other times in history where this kind of thing has happened? I can't think of a substantial example of a army besieging a larger force than they have, and then in anticipation of being themselves surrounded, building a second set of entrenchments and full kind of works around themselves, and then actually winning in a situation like this. This is one of the reasons why Caesar goes down in history.
He next sent out huge foraging parties to collect enough food to sustain his troops for the next 30 days.
Yep, important stuff there too.
Caesar had effectively robbed Vercingetorix of his advantages. With the Romans thus defended and supplied, it was the Gauls who now faced a well-dug-in enemy, and it was now Vercingetorix whose time was running out. With an army of 80,000 men inside the city, plus the civilian population and no way of resupplying, it was only a matter of time before he was starved out. This was Caesar's magnum opus. Faced with a desperate situation, Vercingetorix made the difficult decision to expel anyone who wasn't going to be fighting: the old, the sick, women and children. He had hoped that Caesar would allow these people through the Roman defences and to safety, but Caesar was not in a merciful mood. He refused to let them pass, and the civilians were left between the walls of Alesia and the Romans.
So, I mean, what are you going to do as Caesar? Of course you want him to be stuck with these people. It makes his situation more untenable. He's got to feed them. He's got to protect them. This only increases the chances that Vercingetorix is going to have to surrender his army. So it makes sense that Caesar would say no to that.
Imploring both sides for food and water, neither side relenting. Over the next few days, many died of starvation and thirst, the space between the armies becoming full of the dying and dead. The Gallic allies finally arrived to try and relieve the siege, under the command of Vercingetorix's cousin, Vercassivelanus. It is hard to say precisely how many there were. Caesar claims that the number was as high as 250,000, with modern estimates suggesting somewhere between 70 and 100,000.
That's still a lot of people, and that's still more than Caesar has. So again, he's besieging 80,000 inside the city. He's besieged by 100,000 outside the city. This looks like a death sentence for Caesar and his army. It's an incredible feat that he gets out of this.
Whatever the true number was, all agree that the Romans were now significantly outnumbered, at least 2 to 1. On the first day of their arrival, they quickly filled in the first Roman trench and sent across a combined force of light infantry and cavalry to probe the defences, whilst the rest of the army set up camp. Caesar countered by sending out his own Germanic cavalry, and a fierce skirmish ensued. From their elevated position inside the city, the besieged Gauls saw that their allies had arrived, and simultaneously began massing for a sally against the inner fortifications.
And this is what you have to do if you're the Gauls, right? You outnumber him 2 to 1. You've got to throw everything you've got at him all at once. That's the only way that you can be successful in this situation.
However, the Germans once again proved their skill, outmaneuvering and flanking their Gallic counterparts, forcing them back across the trench and into the Gallic camp. Seeing his allies defeated, Vercingetorix decided to bide his time and held off his attack. The reinforcements spent the next day constructing siege ladders, and then at midnight launched another attack. Taking the Romans by surprise, they found some initial success, but Mark Antony, in his first battle, was commanding this section of the wall and proved himself to be a composed and skillful lieutenant, pulling troops from other sections of the walls to reinforce his position. Again, Vercingetorix began to sally out to try and help his allies, but was delayed by having to fill the Roman trench. By the time he had crossed it, Antony had successfully fought off the assault, and Vercingetorix again withdrew into the city. Following these 2 failed assaults, Vercassivelanus conducted more thorough reconnaissance of the Roman position, and discovered that a steep hill overlooked the Roman wall in the northern section. Hoping to use this high ground to his advantage, the next day the Gauls used their overwhelming numbers to attack the entire length of the outside wall.
So that's what you have to do. Again, you have to use your overwhelming numbers, you've got to use your superior might, and you've got to focus it somewhere where you have the best chance of breaking through and changing the outcome.
But concentrated a larger force under Vercassivelanus on this portion. At the same time, Vercingetorix again sallied out, this time attacking the length of the interior Roman fortifications, hitting wherever looked weakest. This was the toughest the fighting had been so far. Caesar, as he had done at the Battle of Sabis, dashed from cohort to cohort, urging his men on, leading reserve cohorts personally to points where the defences looked like they were faltering. Vercassivelanus began making headway, piling earthworks up against the walls in order to mount them, and using hooks and siege engines to tear down the Roman defences. Caesar committed every man he had left of his reserves, pulling every man who could be spared and sending them into the action.
Look at this. I mean, it's fighting everywhere. And if any one of these places, one side breaks, it can turn the tide of the battle, because you could have a domino effect. Let's say that the Romans break over here, over here, over here. Well, now all of a sudden you shorten that line, and the shorter that line gets, the easier it is for the overwhelming numbers of the Gauls to be able to start breaking you. So you've got to win everywhere.
It was a desperate battle for the Romans. Between the two walls there would be no escape, and if the line faltered, the entire army would surely be wiped out. The Roman line was holding the Gallic army, but it seemed like it wouldn't last for long. But then, Caesar appeared at the top of the hill. Leading the Germanic auxiliaries, he crashed into the rear of the Gallic reinforcements. Surrounded now on all sides, the Gauls who had pushed through the breach were decimated, and the tide of battle changed. Seeing their largest contingent broken, the morale of the rest of the Gallic reinforcements shattered, and they quickly fled. With this threat thus neutralized, the Romans turned to deal with Vercingetorix, who was attacking the interior wall, and they were able to force him back into the city. With the city still besieged and his reinforcements spent, Vercingetorix surrendered. It is unknown how many Romans died, but the casualties must have been fairly significant given the intensity of the fighting, particularly at the point where the fortifications had been breached. The Gallic relief force suffered heavy casualties, the entirety of the besieged army in Alesia was either killed or enslaved, and both Vercassivellaunus and Vercingetorix were taken alive.
So let's take a look real quick at the numbers and see what the modern historical estimates are on the casualties on either side for this. So right here, we're looking at an estimate of 12,800 killed and wounded for Caesar's forces, and 250,000 killed on the side of the Gauls. I mean, this is just outstanding numbers. You've got estimates that the enemy was as high as 400,000. Now, this is kind of interesting. I mean, Caesar's the one who says 250,000 killed and 40,000 captured. Modern estimates are saying that there were less than 70,000. I don't think those numbers are accurate at all. I think they were much higher than that, though I think they're probably less than what Caesar reports. But either way, this is an incredible victory for Caesar and cements his legacy as one of the great generals of all time. And of course, Vercingetorix after this is captured. He's held for the rest of his life as a captive by Caesar. Eventually, Caesar has this triumph, which is basically a big parade in Rome. And at the end of the parade, they strangle Vercingetorix. Some reports say that he was then beheaded, but he was strangled to death in front of the Roman mob, basically. So kind of an undignified end to a guy who had stood up to Caesar so nobly. And if you've ever watched the HBO series Rome, which went for 2 seasons, it begins, the very first episode begins with Vercingetorix's surrender to Caesar and going into captivity.
Although most of the rebel leaders were either dead or captured, the resistance against Rome was far from over, as the Bituriges, Carnutes, Bellovaci, Atrebates, Anticavi, and others were still in open rebellion. In January of 51 BC, Caesar moved against the Bituriges. This winter campaign surprised the Bituriges, who were probably unprepared for it, and soon they sued for peace, which allowed Caesar to return to his winter quarters. However, soon the Bituriges were attacked by the Carnutes for yielding to the Romans. Once again, Caesar marched swiftly and took his enemies by surprise, forcing the Carnutes to submit. The Romans made new winter quarters at Cenabum and stayed there until the spring. Leaving 6 legions in the area, Caesar took 4 and moved against the Bellovaci of Corius and the Atrebates of Commius. This campaign proved difficult, as both tribes abandoned their lands and fought a guerrilla war against the Romans. Fortunately for the legions, Corius was killed in one of the ambushes, which proved to be the final straw for the Bellovaci. They were convinced to seek peace, while Commius retreated to the east to continue his resistance. To the south, the Anticavi attacked Liminum and were defeated by Caesar's lieutenants. The remainder of the Gallic forces in the area attempted to defend at Uxellodunum, but were defeated by Caesar soon after. The last engagement of the war saw Commius defeated in the north, and the rebellion was over. Gaul was pacified, and Caesar won over the remaining Gallic leaders with gifts and the promise of lower tribute. He knew that the battle for Rome was about to start.
Yep.
The civil war that would end the centuries-long republic was just around the corner. Thus ends the first season of our series on Gaius Julius Caesar. But he will be back for the second season, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button.
So yeah, definitely make sure you subscribe to their channel. A lot of great stuff. We are going to continue our conversation about Caesar because honestly, the part of Roman history that I know the most about and that I find myself the most interested in is that period beginning with the end of the Gallic Wars, running up through the empire, which takes place under Caesar's grandnephew, Octavian, or Octavius, I guess was his real name, who becomes known as Caesar Augustus. So that's kind of the most fascinating time to me, those civil wars. So we're going to definitely talk more about that in the future. But let me know your thoughts. If you have other suggestions of things you'd like to see, we'll probably put another vote up very soon for the patrons to vote on. This was the one they overwhelmingly chose to see. So I'd be curious to see what you guys have to say next. Use the comment section below. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.